is Chris Deeran. I'm Director of Reform Scotland. I'd like to welcome you all to today's discussion, which is on the subject of no platforming and the right to free speech, which are two linked issues which have been in the news this week and for many weeks preceding this week. I guess the past decade has seen our politics become ever more polarised, and the art of reasoned debate followed by negotiated compromise, which is often the way societies have progressed, and when politics has been at its most successful, seems to have been somewhat lost. This feels like an angry age. In many cases, there's now an almost quasi-religious, absolutist aspect to the way activists approach politics and its causes. I don't just disagree with you or think you are wrong. I don't accept your right to take a different view. Your position has no value. It's immoral and illegitimate. In fact, you are evil. We've all come across that kind of expression in recent times. And the role played by social media in this phenomenon can't be overestimated. Many of us, especially women, people from minorities, have and do receive horrendous abuse, especially on Twitter, often from anonymous accounts. We know that threats of violence and rape are sadly not uncommon. Social media really is a wild west of lawlessness at times. In recent years, this behaviour has crossed from the digital space into the physical one. We've become quite profoundly unpleasant and unforgiving in our approach to one another. We've seen the rise of cancelling and no platforming, where people are deliberately prevented from contributing to debates by those who oppose their views. Reputations have been shredded, careers ruined, debate refused, aggressive intimidation has been deployed, and in a sense, overreaction has become the norm in our public debate. We've seen this illegitimisation most visibly probably in the debate in Scotland around trans rights, but it's also there in relation to religion, to views on Scottish independence and the Union, on Brexit and the monarchy. You could go on and on. There are probably few of us on this call who haven't felt the lash of the whip or the scorch of the flames over one issue or another. This, it seems to me, isn't a particularly healthy state of affairs. A functioning society is one that can confront its problems, disagree robustly, and then debate its way to change. Change is often most effectively achieved through evolution rather than revolution, slowly winning the argument, changing voters' minds, establishing society's agreement and consent. This is a pathway to change that is lasting and has a broad societal agreement. To make this approach possible, we need to listen to one another, especially those with whom we disagree. Freedom of speech isn't some nice to have bolt on to democracy, it's an essential component of it. And so understanding of and even a degree of empathy with the arguments of those with whom we disagree most is often the first step towards finding a way through. It's essential to listen to dissenting opinions. If we don't listen, we just talk past one another and grow angrier and more frustrated. I was particularly struck by a passage in the writer Raphael Baer's new book where he says, "There is no harm in having steadfast beliefs. The danger comes when opinions are held with such intensity that criticism is construed as treason and reasonable challenge denounced as heresy." I think that should give us all some food for thought. So today we want to talk about this situation, its challenges, what it's like living through cancellation and deplatforming, what free speech means and what it requires of all of us, whichever side of any debate we find ourselves on. We'll take questions from the audience and hopefully hear a variety of views, but do let me know your questions in advance so I can select the most interesting ones. You can do that using the Zoom chat function. So let me introduce our panel today, which includes people who have been victims of and participants in this debate. We have Kate Forbes, the SNP MP for Skye, Lochaber and Badenoch, former Finance and Economy Secretary, recent contender for the SNP leadership. We have Joanna Cherry, SNP for MP for Edinburgh South West and King's Council. We have Jenny Lindsay, poet and writer. Adam Tompkins is the John Miller Professor of Public Law at the University of Glasgow and a former Conservative MSP. And we have Ian Leslie, who is the author of Conflicted, Why Arguments Are Tearing Us Apart and How They Can Bring Us Together. So welcome to all of you and thank you for joining us today. I wanted to start with Jenny, who's, if you've been reading the papers over the weekend, you may have seen her story being told. She's had a rough time of it, and I thought it might be useful to hear from Jenny about the situation she's in, how she got into it, and what it's been like having to live through it. Jenny, could I ask you to maybe just set that out for us?
Yeah, how long do you have though?
If you can keep it relatively short so everyone else can
Of course, headlines only. So I think, thanks very much for asking me to contribute, because as people will know, I'm not a public figure, I'm not a household name at all, and this has affected me deeply. I would say that just like yourself, over a number of years, I've been growing increasingly alarmed, actually, at calls for noise protests outside feminist meetings. I've been watching what had been happening in North America with the sort of TERF trans debate, and I was so worried that it was going to come to Scotland, and sure enough it did. And that style of activism, the noise protests, the smearing of the opponents, it really alarms me. And it wasn't anonymous Twitter people that I was noticing doing this, it was my peers. It was my peers in the literary world. So I was, even before I spoke out in this issue, I was alarmed and I was frightened. And as an events programmer, I'd started to have people try to get me to cancel people as well, which I never did. But it was, I felt like I was trying to create work in an atmosphere of serious tension. So in the summer of 2019, it was time was up for me to say something when I saw the publication of a justification for inciting violence against lesbians at Pride. And this was published in a mainstream arts publication. And so I very politely made one tweet calling this out, and overnight my life went absolutely insane. I was called a TERF. I was told that I shouldn't be tone policing trans people and all of these different kinds of things. Now, the author of that column was somebody who, a few days after my tweet, attempted to assault Julie Bindel outside Edinburgh University. So instead of people saying, oh, maybe Jenny had a point, people doubled down. My publisher was harassed. People who worked with me were harassed. Now, bear in mind, I'm not a public figure, and all of this was kind of bubbling under the surface for about 7 months. People trying to get me fired from things, my income tanking, and me not really 100% knowing why. And then it burst onto Twitter in February 2020, quite a febrile time just before lockdown, when a young poet I've never met called me a TERF and tried to harass a small publisher to drop me from their programme. I retaliated, of course, and then the Scottish Poetry Library got involved, issuing a statement opposing calls for no platforming by poets against other poets, which led to almighty hell with open letters and the SPL being accused of institutional transphobia. And all of the time this has been reported in the papers with my name sort of attached to it, but people weren't 100% sure what I'd done, just that you've got to avoid me now, you know. So it was also spiraling out of control. And obviously when you're put in a position where you're asked what your beliefs are on this issue, you've got a choice to either lie or set out your case. And I was very lucky, I was commissioned by the Dark Horse Literary Journal to write a really extensive account of actually what happened to me and what is going on in the Scottish literary world. And that was 8,205 words long. And it was published in September in print only, first of all. It didn't even go out on the internet, and that was very important to us because we just wanted some calm. And it is a call for calm, and it is a call for open dialogue. And I was very careful to try and make none of my hounders identifiable, which has not been afforded to me. So I'd hoped I could write this essay and maybe get back to doing what I love once lockdown ended. But I have found over the last few weeks that I am not permitted to do that. I am facing discrimination from venues refusing to allow me to hire them. And even when I do manage to find a venue, those venues get harassed. And I just want to, just to sum up and just to finish, because I'm aware I've been speaking for a while, I just want to very quickly lay out what my beliefs are. The first is that women are materially definable as a category of human being. That is a very banal belief. The second belief is that women are legislatively important on the basis of that category. That is a status quo position. That is a women's rights defence. And the third part of my belief is that I strongly believe that women have a right to meet, to freedom of assembly, to meet and discuss legislation that pertains to our lives. And those set of beliefs have been allowed to become so toxic that not just politicians like Joanna Cherry or famous authors like J.K. Rowling, but individual poets, skint poets like myself are being permitted to be hounded out of a livelihood. And I do think it's a disgrace. And I want to thank you so much for doing this forum, because it has to change. It really does. Anyway, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jenny. Joanna, I'd like to come on to you now as someone who's also been in the news recently. Not that you're out the news very often, but obviously the events at the stand where you'd been asked to take part in a conversation at a fringe event and then found that offer withdrawn because the staff at the fringe apparently didn't want to work the event because they disagreed with your views. Do you want to tell us a bit about that? And I know that you're now thinking, or you've suggested you might take legal action if there isn't an apology.
I will be taking legal action if they don't accede to the demands in my lawyer's letter. Absolutely no question about that, Chris. Thanks for organising this. And I just want to start by thanking Jenny. I really want to thank you, Jenny, for challenging somebody who said that it's all right to beat up lesbians at Pride. I've been out since the 80s and I can't go to Pride now because I fear for my personal safety from trans rights activists and their supporters. And a lot of lesbians feel like that. And my friend Alison Bailey, the English barrister who won a case against her chambers for being harassed and discriminated against on the grounds of her gender critical beliefs, has said very powerfully that our rights as lesbians and gay men are not conditional on accepting gender identity theory. And I think all of this really stems from a shocking lack of ignorance, particularly amongst the political class, about human rights and equality law. I chair the Joint Committee on Human Rights at Westminster when we were reporting on potential human rights reform, and Adam took part in that inquiry and was very helpful to us. One of the things that we said was we felt that there needed to be better civic education about the universality of human rights. And that, in fact, was our recommendation of the independent review of the Human Rights Act. They wanted to keep the Human Rights Act, but they felt we needed to have better education about it so people realised human rights are for everyone, not just for foreign national offenders, as those on the right, or some on the right, would have us believe. And I think the same applies to the Equality Act. I think universities, employers, political parties have all been captured by a misrepresentation of the Equality Act. And before I say a bit about what happened with the stand, I just want to challenge something you said at the beginning, Chris. This is not a debate about trans rights. I'm not interested in debating trans rights. I accept that trans people have equal rights. It would be surprising if I didn't, as a lawyer and a chair of a human rights committee. The equal rights for trans people are protected under the Equality Act, very broadly drawn, protected characteristic of gender reassignment. And there's no one I'm aware of is asking that be removed. But there's no human right to self-identification. The Strasbourg court have been very clear about that, and so have our courts of our domestic legal systems in the United Kingdom. There's no right for anyone to self-ID as the opposite sex with minimal safeguards. That just doesn't exist in law as a right. And so that is up for debate. I first stuck my head above the parapet on this issue in May 2019, and Fraser, my fantastic political advisor, warned me that when I did so, it would probably damage my political career and ruin any chance I would ever have of putting myself forward for the SNP leadership. I didn't believe him, but I think he was right, actually. And I found it absolutely appalling, the onslaught on the views of me and other feminists and lesbians like me over the last few years. But I think it's really important for me as a politician to speak out. It's quite hard to get rid of me unless my constituents kick me out. But people like Jenny are losing their livelihood. And so it's really important for people like me in public life to take a stand against not just no platforming and an attack on free speech, but fundamentally discriminatory action against lesbians and feminists who don't accept gender identity ideology. And there's very clear case law now, thanks to Maya Forstater, that those philosophical beliefs are protected. So very quickly, what happened with the stand was they approached me through Tommy Shepherd and a promoter in January to ask if I wanted to take part in their In Conversation series. It's not my event, it's their event. I said, yes, I'd love to. I'd done a similar event at the Fringe last year with Matt Ford, and it seemed to have been quite well received. The tickets were advertised, and then in March, a comedian who is a trans woman who was due to be appearing at the Stand in Glasgow cancelled her performance and made an attack on me. I think what she said was something along the lines of, I had devoted my life to excluding trans people from public life, which is ludicrous, really, and a statement with no factual basis whatsoever. The Stand got a bit twitchy at that point, but put out a fairly reasonable statement about how they're against discrimination. And then matters escalated, and about 10 days or so ago, they told me the event was going to be cancelled because they couldn't staff it in a way that was legally compliant, to use their words, because their staff are not comfortable with me. So that's what happened. And it's not so much an issue of free speech as discrimination. I was invited by the Stand to appear. They offered their venue and services at their venue for the interview with me, and then they withdrew it because of my gender critical beliefs. And I've got pretty robust legal advice about that. And so, as I've put in the public domain, unless the Stand acknowledge their unlawful discrimination, apologise to me and reinstate the event, then I will take them to court, because I think it's really important that we have a clear statement in Scotland, in a case that has some publicity, that discriminating against women, and indeed men like me who hold these beliefs, is unlawful. Now, if people in public life in positions of leadership, like university principals, employers in the public sphere, political leaders, were prepared to take a stand on this, then perhaps I wouldn't find myself in this position. But the political class seemed to have been seized by a collective cowardice on this issue, with a few honourable exceptions, and also, as I said earlier, an alarming collective ignorance of equality law and human rights law. So that's where I am, really. And I'm doing this partly for myself, because if I don't challenge this now, this is going to keep happening to me. And what's being said about me is very damaging to my reputation. I might not always be an MP if I were to lose my seat next year. There's various career opportunities that might be closed down to me if I don't challenge this discrimination and this attack on my reputation. But I am doing it also for other women, because I come across many women in the course of my work who find themselves not just being no platformed, but losing their jobs, or, like Jenny, their means to earn a livelihood. Jenny is one. There's Shireen Benjamin at Edinburgh University. There's Rosie Kay, the dancer and photographer. There's Denise Fahmy, the whistleblower about homophobia at the Arts Council in England. There's Dr. Laura Favaro, an academic who lost her job and had her research confiscated for wrongthink. There's Professor Joe Phoenix, who's currently taking the Open University to court. And of course, there's the case of Kathleen Stock. And I could go on and on and on. But lots of these women are out of the public eye and aren't necessarily in the position that I'm in to take this forward. So yeah, it's not entirely altruistic, because I want to protect my own reputation, my own ability to earn a living. But it's very much something that I want to do to help other women, and indeed men, in this position. And there are some men who face this sort of discrimination as well.
Okay, thank you for that, Joanna. Kate, you have not long finished quite a competitive leadership contest in the SNP, and I suppose one of the things that came up during that were your religious views, and there was a backlash against that, especially in the first week, and you've spoken a bit about the right of people of faith to take part in politics and not to be prevented from holding those views and maybe reaching high office as we go. What are your reflections on that? It's obviously about more than just gender reform we're talking about here. There are a number of issues that provoke a similar response, if not quite as angry. But what are your reflections on having come through that process recently?
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks for having me along. And I suppose I'd start by having heard the previous two speakers commending the bravery of many in Scotland. think my situation is relevant, not because I believe it's relevant to this debate, but because I cannot tell you the volume of correspondence I received in the aftermath of the leadership contest, which started with the lines. It was almost like it was copy and paste. Started with the lines, I fundamentally disagree with your views, but I support your freedom or your right to express your views. And my sense in this, as somebody in a public position, is that I should be subject to scrutiny. But you can't have scrutiny if you use different tactics to shut somebody down. And I think we've heard already in this session the different tactics that are increasingly being used in Scotland to prevent freedom of speech. It's not about debating and disputing somebody's views. It's about using tactics like boycott, like isolation, like sacking somebody, like employing accusations that are not founded in reality to ensure that somebody doesn't have a voice. And I suppose if I had 3 reflections, which I'll keep relatively brief, is that I was quite amazed and heartened by the backlash to the backlash that I'm increasingly seeing in Scotland. I certainly received support from very unexpected places, support from people who fundamentally disagreed with me on every single front, and yet said that they believed I deserved to be heard. And the reason is that you cannot dispute and debate that which you will not hear. The public, I think, are fed up of being scared and intimidated themselves from saying that which, as Jenny says, that which is widely accepted as fact. And they're fed up of being scared and intimidated by seeing what public figures are subject to. So I think there's a backlash to the backlash from the majority in Scotland and from individuals with whom I would disagree and who disagree with me. The second thing I would say is that, as I've briefly alluded to, scrutiny of public figures really matters. That scrutiny takes the form of querying, questioning, debating. It's accountability, but you can't scrutinise that which will not be heard. And it's so important, I think, for the truth to out when there is that fair, respectful debate. You know, I think I didn't quite follow the intricacies of the news. I think I was subject to a complaint for saying that Isla Bryson was a man. And that's another tactic, I think, of trying to shut people down. But scrutiny matters. And I think defending scrutiny means defending freedom of speech, especially if you believe in the truth. And I think my last point is that this is really a battle of culture, not of legal rights, because I'm no lawyer and we have lawyers on this panel, but I think the law generally has found in favour, as it were, of that right which we know we possess when it comes to freedom of speech. It's the culture. It's a culture of fear that is suppressing the opportunity to have a fair, free debate. And I suppose, without being drawn on too many specifics, I was really struck during my own situation that those who knew my views and came out instinctively in support of me and then withdrew support were fearful of being hounded themselves in the same way that I was being hounded. And, you know, they had to abandon public support for fear that they too would be subject to the same treatment. And that's very dangerous for democracy and for good law, because ironically enough, democracy demands disagreement. If you look at the parliamentary timetable is debate. You cannot debate where everybody agrees. And good law is born of conflict and dispute, in my humble opinion. You stifle debate, you end up with bad law. And bad law has serious implications for all of us. Going full circle, I've just said the problem isn't the law, it's the culture. Well, you end up with bad law when the culture is, in my view, corrupted or tarnished. So that culture of fear is stymieing good discussion. It will inevitably stymie art, comedy, journalism, all the different occupations that rely on that freedom to foster good ideas. So I'm both disheartened, but also heartened, because I think the public will not sort of allow that culture to be undermined. And I think they're seeing through it and getting increasingly fed up.
Thank you, Kate. And Adam, you have departed Holyrood for the world of academia once again, and I guess it's the world of universities where we're perhaps seeing this debate play out in its rawest. We know that at Edinburgh University, where they've tried to show Adult Human Female, the film, a couple of times, those showings have been shut down by protests. I know you are doing work on freedom of speech at the moment. I wonder if you could reflect a bit on what freedom of speech gives us in terms of rights and responsibilities, but also talk a bit about the culture in universities and where we've got to on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks very much, Chris. And first of all, let me just say how much I agree on this issue with all three of the previous speakers. I think that you said something in the introduction, Chris, that really is incredibly important. It's really easy to defend free speech when you agree with what's being said. It's easy and not very interesting. Your commitment to free speech is tested when you are seeking to defend the right of people to speak things which you disagree with. It's speech with which one disagrees that really tests our commitment to free speech. And I think that the importance of that point has been lost sight of in some of the. One of the dangers that we face is that free speech gets caught in the crosswires of a culture war. And that the people, for example, who defend Joanna's speech with regard to the issue that she referred to in her remarks are only those who agree with her stand on trans rights and self-ID. That's a very dangerous place for free speech to be, because, as I just said, free speech is much more important than that, and we need to. One of the things that we need to do is kind of lift it out of the culture wars, and to ensure that we are defending and reflecting each other's right to freedom of speech, even and perhaps especially where we disagree with what is being said. I want to complicate the conversation a little bit, though, because free speech is very far from being an absolute. We all have a right to free speech, but none of us has an absolute right to free speech, and in my view, nor should we. I am not a free speech militant, and I don't think anybody on the panel is. I mean, the other people on the panel can speak for themselves. I don't propose to speak for them, but certainly nothing that I'm about to say is intended to be a criticism of anything that Joanna, Kate, or Jenny have already said. And let me just try and complicate it a little bit by saying that yes, we all absolutely have a right to free speech, but none of us has the right to say anything that we like. And even more importantly, I think, none of us has the right to say things and expect that there can never be consequences in respect of what we have said. So it's quite difficult to speak about this in the general without talking about specifics, because free speech is a general principle, it's a universal right. But it's quite hard to think kind of coherently about it unless you've kind of got particular sets of facts in front of you. So forgive me if some of this sounds a little bit woolly, but let me just put one really important distinction on the table. I do not have the right to use my words to threaten anybody. I do not have the right to use my words to abuse anybody. And free speech does not include or extend to the use of words which is threatening or abusive. So an example of that, an example very close to my heart, would be anti-Semitism. None of us has the right to use words that threaten Jewish people because of their identity, or that abuse Jewish people because of their identity. And I say that it's close to my heart because I have 4 Jewish children. But one of the things that we have lost sight of, and I think the reason why we're here, actually, the reason why so much of the controversy that Jenny has found herself embroiled in and that Joanna has found herself embroiled in, is because we've lost sight of what used to be a really quite well understood and still is a really important distinction. And that's the distinction between threatening and abusing people on the one hand, which ought to be and is unlawful, and upsetting people or offending people, or hurting or shocking people on the other hand. And the answer, Chris, to speech which you find offensive, speech which you find hurtful or upsetting, is not to censor it. The answer is to speak back. So the answer, when you're confronted with speech that you find upsetting or offensive or hurtful or even shocking, is not to seek to censor that person or cancel them or even censure them for what they have said. The answer is more speech, not more censorship. The answer is to talk back. I think that I entirely agree with the huge importance of the point that Joanna Cherry was making about the need for some civic education here, in particularly amongst people in positions of leadership, and that includes university principals and vice chancellors, but it's not unique to them by any stretch of imagination. If we could get one thing right in that course of education, it would be to recreate the significance of the distinction I've just tried to put on the table. Free speech does not extend to the right to threaten or abuse each other, but it absolutely does extend to the right to use words which other people happen to find offensive or disagreeable or hurtful or shocking. And I don't say that because I want to use words that offend or shock people. I don't set out, believe it or not, I don't set out to be offensive or shocking, even on Twitter. I don't set out to be offensive or shocking on Twitter, but if the consequences of my speech are that other people are offended or hurt or shocked, then the answer to that is not for me to be silenced, or Joanna or anybody else to be silenced, but for the counter argument to be put. But as Kate said brilliantly a few minutes ago, the counter argument can only be put after the argument has first been heard. And a really important part of the right to free speech is the right to hear what other people have to say, especially when you disagree with it, because then your own arguments will become sharper and better, your own position will become sharper and better, and we might make progress as a society in terms of inching a little further towards the truth. Let me just make one final very quick point, if I may, which is just a slight disagreement with something that Kate said, and that is about the importance of the extent to which our law gets this right. Now, I think our law does, by and large, get this right when the person who is seeking to stop your speech is the state. I think when we're thinking about criminal law, and it's the state that prosecutes us in the case of criminal law, I think the law of free speech in both Scots law and in the legal jurisdictions of the rest of the United Kingdom is broadly correct. But all of the instances that Joanna talked about, Maya Forstatter, Alison Bailey, Kathleen Stock, her own case, Franklin Graham at the SEC a couple of years ago, in none of those cases was it the state that was seeking to cancel or stop the speaker. In all of those cases, it was another private party, typically the employer. And I'm not sure that our law of free speech is sufficiently robust in the context of disputes that employees might take against their employers, for example. So I think there are areas where it would be quite useful actually to have a discussion about how we can ensure not just that the culture of free speech is maintained and protected, not just in Scotland, but throughout the United Kingdom, but also that the law of free speech is enhanced and improved.
Okay, thanks for now, Adam. Ian, your book, which I said was called Conflicted, but in its newest edition has been renamed How to Disagree, which is quite timely. You argue that confronting our differences is the only way to make the most out of them, which I guess chimes with some of the things we've heard today. And you explore how to do that successfully, how to disagree well in an era that feels more divided than ever. What's your take on the direction that we've taken in society and the causes behind it? And then we can maybe talk about how we can fix it. But how did we get to this position?
Well, that's a big question. I think that the first thing we have to recognize, and Adam alluded to this, is it's really hard. Free speech and being in a society, being in a group, being with a person where you are disagreed with is really difficult for us to deal with, right? We're not necessarily wired for disagreement. We grew up in settlements or small communities where the whole point was you kind of got along with each other and you were hostile to those guys over there. And if someone was in a disagreement with you, that likely kind of signaled they were about to hit you with a club. And so, you know, we as soon as we're in a disagreement, we feel, you know, our chest tightens, our heart rate raises. We worry about the damage that we're going to do to the relationship that when we're disagreeing with somebody. You know, it's stressful and it's disagreement. And that's true of liberal democracy just generally, right? Liberal democracy kind of goes against the grain of human nature in some ways. The idea that we live with people, we're all going to argue with each other and have different points of view, but we're still going to cohere as a society, is a tough one. It's an absolutely fabulous idea as well. But we should recognize how tough it is. You know, why do we do it? Why do we do this difficult thing? Well, first of all, because we think it's the best way. You know, free speech is the best way to guarantee people's freedoms, including the freedoms of minorities and people who don't get heard. Which is why it's so important that when we talk about free speech, we also talk about equal speech, right? We have to pursue the idea that everybody has the right and as close as we can, you know, an equality of platform as well as freedom of speech. We also do it because it makes us smarter. It makes us more intelligent, right? It's the best way we have, really, of raising the collective intelligence of a society, of a group. You know, as individuals, we are not that smart. We're like neurons in a brain, right? The neurons in a brain are pretty dumb, you know, switches. But if you get 86 billion of them working together, you have this incredibly powerful computer. And societies are the same, that individuals are much smarter when they're working in collaboration with others. And disagreement is one of the best ways, if not the best way we have of talking through our views with each other. And, you know, Kate alluded to it. It makes better law. It makes better politics. It's the essence of democracy. And as I say, it's hard, and people will find strategies to avoid it. You know, people will either withdraw. People will be passive in the face of disagreement. I mean, I am. A lot of us are conflict averse in lots of different ways, right? But another strategy of avoidance is to shut people down. Another strategy of avoidance is to abuse people. These are all ways of avoiding the discomfort and the difficulty, and sometimes the kind of the exhaustion, the emotional exhaustion of engaging with somebody and disagreeing with them. And so I think we have to, you know, overcome that in as many different ways as we can. It's not made easier by social media, because what social media does is kind of rip the context out of disagreements. Disagreements go much better when there's some kind of common shared either views or just kind of social context, you know, me kind of understanding where you're coming from, roughly, me having an intuitive feel for what you're like as a human being or as a representative of a group. Social media kind of takes all that context out, and all you have is the view. All the thing is, you know, these few words in a box which represent some words which kind of instinctively trigger your aversions. So that social media kind of accelerates the existing discomfort we have with disagreement and makes it even harder to deal with. So, probably the fewer kind of debates and disagreements we have on social media, the better. But I'm probably not one to speak in that regard. So I think in terms of doing it better, it's about building that context back in. The more we can find some kind of common ground and then get to the disagreement, right? Common ground is not about avoiding the disagreement. It should be the springboard for the disagreement. Like, Henry Kissinger said, not that he's an exemplary figure in morally, but he said, you start with the areas of agreement, then you move to the areas of disagreement, right? It's just a basic kind of rule of diplomacy. And you can apply that in every context. You can apply that in arguments with your partner. But we can definitely apply it in political debates. We find some sort of common ground, which might be a view, an argument, or a kind of something we agree on, or it might be an emotional thing. Some of the best, somebody pointed out that in the States, some of the best political arguments in this incredibly polarized political community, red versus blue, take place on the forums of sports websites, because people have this background kind of agreement that we're all into the same team or we're all into the same sport, and therefore here we can actually discuss our differences reasonably. So there may be either something you agree on or something that you kind of feel the same way about, and then you can get into it, and then we can kind of build that common ground in, the better. But yeah, I'll let you talk now so we can get back into some disagreements.
Thank you, Ian. I guess one of the issues you raised there, Ian, was that idea of finding the areas of agreement before you get into disagreement. And I'm interested in the political leadership we've seen in recent months and years. And if it brings us back to the gender issue again, I'd apologise for that. But you know, it could be argued that that wasn't the way that the gender reform bill was brought to bear. That as I've written myself, that it felt like the First Minister took quite a hard and fast, quite extreme position from the off, didn't necessarily try to build a coalition behind that, and actually proved quite unwilling to compromise and listen to the opposing views that emerged over the course of a few years. Kate, what's your sort of view of the political leadership we saw? I mean, you know, had you been First Minister during that point and were putting a gender reform bill, how would you have gone about doing that in a way that maybe wouldn't have left us in this situation we are now, where we're probably going to end up in the Supreme Court? The Scottish Parliament can't pass its bill. There's still this tug about, you know, what should be in the bill, should it be reformed or whatever. Do you think there was a different path that could have been taken that would have advanced trans rights, but would have taken greater account of women's rights as they are?
So I think yes, and if I mention two principles that I think were lost. The first is that there's nearly always less that divides us than we think. Because when you unpack the sort of entrenched views, you discover that there is a majority that can reach consensus. And I believe that there was a way forward, but it had to start with a willingness to listen to the other side and to find what unites us in this case. Now, I think it's a really difficult issue to talk about, but you know, Joanna just said that she fundamentally believes in trans rights. And I think that most of the women I spoke to who were concerned, and I've never seen an issue like this, which motivated women across my constituency to speak to me in surgery, advice surgeries, that most of them started with a desire to see trans rights furthered, but also to access protections for women and girls. So I think it had to start with an appreciation that there was more that united us than divided us. But secondly, I think the treatment of those that expressed concerns was just completely unacceptable. And therefore, it meant that there was no hope of building a bridge that we could have built at the beginning. Now, that is perhaps an extreme example, but Chris, I think it applies to every single debate that we're currently engaged in. I mean, if I move to another entrenched debate, the Constitution, I believe that there's a lot more that unites no and yes voters, for example, the future prosperity of Scotland, than we think. And actually, if we have a debate that revolves around how to reach that future prosperity for Scotland, you discover that people are a lot more sort of fluid and flexible in their views on the Constitution than you might otherwise think. But if you start with the premise that we disagree and there's no bridge building, then you're never going to further that. I'm engaged in another debate which will be of little interest to your listeners in the form of highly protected marine areas. And again, aside from all the noise, there's a lot that unites us. But if each side others the other side as unacceptable, beyond the pale, you're never, ever going to reach a consensus.
Okay, thanks, Kate. I'd like to get maybe a voice from the other side of the debate. And Katie Nicol-Baines, I think from Edinburgh University, you're on the chat. I see quite a bit, and I just wondered, you sort of ask if disagreement and discussion is so vital to make progress. How do we actually do that? Would you maybe expand a bit on your thoughts on this, if you'd like to speak?
Hi, Chris. Yeah,
Hiya.
thanks. Appreciate the heads up. I was literally just finishing my lunch, so thank you. Yeah, I think this kind of backs up onto what Kate was just talking about in terms of the notion of bringing people together. There's a lot of call for that without any real sort of practical mechanism or suggestion of how it's possible. And I think it links back to this culture of fear that people experience when the type of views or discussion or the topic of debate is experienced as an attack on somebody's rights, an attack on somebody's right to be who they are safely in society. And so I'm curious to know how others here feel it's possible to build that framework to get to a point where it's even possible to have the conversation. Because I think I certainly take the time to listen and understand the views. But whether I feel it's conducive at certain points in time to actively disagree, that takes a lot more measured approach and consideration. Because I think I'm unclear as to the primary motivation and the outcome. I'm very practical in my approach to this. I want to know what the reality of the purpose of having the debate is. A lot of this happens on a sort of philosophical level of like, what is gender, what is sex, what are our beliefs about that? But the actual material reality for people living their lives in Scotland and in the UK and the rest of the world is, to me, what really matters. And so how can we build towards that kind of shared understanding of what's possible?
I've been asked to unmute, but I don't know, should I jump in? I do have some thoughts on this.
Yes, please do, Jenny. Yeah.
Okay, so one of the things that I want to make very, very clear is that what happened with me was I was not being told that I was transphobic for anything that I did. It was insinuations about what was inside my brain. So quite a lot of people got involved in hounding me and attacking me and saying at the same time, I'm so shocked by her actions. I can't believe she's gone down this path, when I've had these feminist beliefs since my teens. And so I think one of the things that we absolutely have to do is to challenge this idea that thoughts themselves are harmful and look at the evidence for how people act. I mean, I have been programming in live literature. I've been programming trans writers since I was 20. The first trans women I ever met used my cabaret series to come out. I have never done anything that has been discriminatory towards transgender people. And so that's one thing we absolutely have to do, is look at the evidence for in this particular debate, which is the most divisive debate I have ever been involved in, and I was involved in IndieRef as well, and look at the actions. Who's discriminating against who here? Yeah. Because I would speak with anyone from the other side about their views, and in fact, I'm attempting to do that with someone who's worried they're getting entrenched and lacking empathy for the other side. And I desperately tried to speak to transgender friends in the literary world before this all kicked off too. And I would really like that reciprocated. And Katie talks about the culture and wanting, to move forward. The very first thing that needs to happen is a challenge to this activism. The activism is frightening. The justifications for violence against women are frightening. Joyful protest is one thing, barricading the entrance to a university is quite another. And so that's what I would say to that about moving on.
Katie, in terms of the barricading of the university and these protests that are stopping things, do you think that's justified? Is it justified because of the scale of the challenge that the trans community faces, or do you think that there is a better way to, does it rebound in a sense because people that respond to that respond in a negative way? They don't see an attempt to debate, they see an attempt to shut down, so you're not really advancing the case?
I mean, I can't directly comment on the tactics of other protesters because that wasn't our approach. I would clarify that my perception of what they did was sitting in front of the doors. Whether that's perceived as a barricade is another matter. The choice for security to use barriers was another thing, and again, I wasn't involved in that. I think our approach to protesting through joyful celebration and platforming what we believe as being a space that is safe for our trans and non-binary staff and students was the right approach, because we know we've seen the film, we understand the content, and we've heard the views that are aired in that film, and so it was up to then people to choose whether or not they went to view it or not. As to whether or not the university is an appropriate venue for that is, again, also the decision of people who manage the university, and that's not myself. I'm there as a member of staff. I support staff who experience the harm that has come about through the type of propaganda that Adult Human Female propagates. But again, I'm not a trans person, so I can't speak to that harm directly. I can only speak to my own personal experience, which is that people tend, in my experience, to attack my personal characteristics rather than the arguments that I might be making. And I fully condemn any form of violence against anybody. I'm a staunch advocate for women's rights and have fought for survivors in many other activist spaces in my activist career. So it's not something I condone at all. And I don't think those activists who chose to sit in front of the doors were doing a violent thing. They were literally sitting in front of the building. How that was managed might have created some tensions and reactions, and I completely see that, and there is a huge amount of emotions. And so I think then going back to what is possible, how do we perhaps, I'm not sure what the right word is, but it's almost like calm the emotions to a point where it's even possible to have these dialogues, like Jenny's talked about, being able to reach out to people and have these kind of conversations, I imagine is going to be essential if we're going to make any progress. So yeah, where the information comes from is another matter.
Joanna, you know, as someone who has been quite heavily identified with one side of this discussion, that Katie's saying, how do we get to the point where we can actually make progress on this in a way that allows maybe both sides to reach agreement or move forward?
One of the reasons that this discussion, and if we may call it that, has become so unpleasant is because activists on one side of the debate set out with a policy of no debate to silence anyone who disagreed with them. And it's hard to identify another area of our public discourse where that has happened. Even in the heated independence debate, I don't think anyone really on either side was seriously suggesting, at least no reputable organisations were seriously suggesting, that there should be no debate. But in relation to the potential conflict of rights between women's rights and LGBT rights and trans rights, or a right to self-ID, there has been a deliberate attempt by many organisations to shut down the debate. Stonewall, once an organisation which I supported, created the hashtag no debate. So that's where the problem comes from. As to how we resolve it, I can give you an example from my own experience and a suggestion that I made 3.5 years ago. When I first became involved in defending LGBT and women's rights from gender identity theory and ideology, a trans woman, one of my constituents, came to see me at a constituency surgery. And initially, our conversation was a bit stilted, and perhaps we both had preconceptions of where the other one stood. But once we had a facilitated dialogue, we realised that we were much closer together than we had realised. And we ended up writing jointly to the Scottish Government, proposing that there should be a citizens' assembly on the issue of reform of the Gender Recognition Act, so that you would, this had happened in Ireland with a very difficult topic in Irish society, which was abortion, and resulted in the amendment of the Irish Constitution to allow for some abortion rights, something that many people in Ireland thought would never happen. So we wanted to see a citizens' assembly at which a cross-section of the electorate would take evidence from everyone involved and then deliberate upon matters and make recommendations to the Scottish Parliament. I'm very sorry that that suggestion wasn't taken up, and I've renewed it several times since, but never with a positive response. And I think that's why we've ended up with legislation which doesn't have public buy-in. Now, I'm no fan of the British government dictating to Holyrood what it can and can't legislate on, although that is a reality of devolution. But what I would like to point out is, if Scotland was an independent country with a written constitution which protected human rights, incorporated the ECHR and protected us against discrimination, then this legislation would be getting challenged in a constitutional court as well. And I do think political leadership has been sadly lacking here. We have had leading politicians tell us that women's concerns weren't valid, and then they turned out to be valid. And people like myself have been accused of being transphobic, homophobic and racist. It's a bit ludicrous to accuse a lesbian of being homophobic. But, you know, this kind of language has consequences. I'm going to court in the summertime to give evidence against a trans rights activist who threatened to kill me. I have already been involved in another criminal prosecution where a member of my own party threatened to rape me because they didn't like my views on these matters. And many politicians have found it very hard to get any words of condemnation out of their mouth about those threats. And I think that tells us that something is very wrong in our society. Just lastly, on the Edinburgh showing of the film, I'm sure we have people on the call who were there to show or view the film who were prevented from doing so. And I think it might be quite interesting to hear what they have to say in response to what the other speaker, I think her name was Katie, said, because I certainly know from speaking to people who were there, I wasn't, that it certainly didn't seem like a joyful celebration to them. And I don't think there's anything joyful about preventing lesbians and feminists from viewing a film with which others might disagree, as Professor Tompkins has said so eloquently, but is not actually abusive or in any sense threatening. Thank you.
Adam, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I said in my previous remark that I wanted to complicate things a little bit, not because just because I think the complication reflects the reality of just how nuanced and difficult some of these things is. Some of these things are. A distinction has been created in the course of the conversation between peaceful protest and violent protest. And I don't think that's a very helpful distinction, or at least I don't think it's the whole of the distinction. I think that there is a distinction which I would want to make between speaking and disrupting. And if I hear somebody that I disagree with, if I hear views that I dislike, if I hear views that I find offensive, I want to argue back. I want to speak more. I don't want to disrupt what's being said. And whether you call, sitting in front of a room and stopping people from getting into it to watch a film peaceful or not, it was unquestionably disruptive. And what was happening there was that people who wanted to watch a film, perhaps to educate themselves, perhaps to inform themselves about the nature of a debate, were being disrupted, prevented from doing that. And frankly, I don't care whether it's peaceful. Well, I do care whether it's peaceful or not, but I don't think that's the material distinction. I think the material distinction is the one I'm seeking to make. But let me just give you a different example, just to move it away from the issue of trans rights and gender self-ID, because that is such a polarizing issue at the moment. It's such a toxic issue. Let me give you two other examples of where I think we need just to be mindful of the nuances of the disagreements and of the complications of this. The first example is what happened in Westminster on Saturday, when leading members of Republic were arrested by the Metropolitan Police very near the coronation procession. Now, where and when and how you choose to express your views matters. It's not immaterial. It's absolutely material. It matters. It makes a very significant difference. If Republic were out there in Trafalgar Square today, the Metropolitan Police wouldn't be taking any action against them. If they wanted to protest on Saturday, the day of the coronation, and nothing that I'm saying here is endorsing what the police did. All right, this is not, I'm just trying to explain how complicated it is. If Republic wanted to demonstrate on the day of the coronation, then do it somewhere other than where the coronation is actually taking place. Why? Because all of these rights are held in balance against the rights of others. And there are the rights of the people who want to go and watch the coronation. There are the rights of the people who want to go in and celebrate the coronation. I was perfectly happy just watching it on television. Myself, I didn't feel the need to go there, but that's just my view. And none of these rights are absolute. They have to be held in balance with one another. And the way in which the law tries to navigate its way through this maze, and it is a maze, it's very complex, is through the doctrine of proportionality. So the police are able to arrest people who want to engage in public protest only when that police action would be proportionate, when it's necessary in order to safeguard the public or in order to protect the rights and interests of others. And if only we held onto that idea of proportionality, not just when we're talking about the police, but also when we're talking about other disruptive behavior, whether it's Extinction Rebellion disrupting traffic on the M25, or whether it's trans rights activists disrupting the showing of a film outside a lecture theatre on the University of Edinburgh campus. How you choose to exercise your rights is material. It matters. And the other example I would give you are the proposals, still only proposals in Scotland, but it's actually now law, I think, in England and Wales, and certainly it's law in Northern Ireland, to ban protest in the immediate vicinity of a clinic that supplies abortion services to women. Nobody here is saying to pro-life protesters that you cannot express your view or indeed even protest your view. Just don't do it in the immediate vicinity of an abortion clinic. It seems to me that that's the analogy that I would draw with what happened to the Republic organizers on Saturday. It's time and place matters. The final point on this is that these are examples that are not about free speech. These are examples that are actually about freedom of assembly. They're not about what we say, they're about what we do. And one of the things that gets lost in all of this, and gets lost so quickly, was actually an issue that Jenny she talked about in her remarks a few minutes ago. We just need to, I know I'm always creating distinctions here, we need to keep in mind the distinction between freedom of conscience, which is our ability to think and believe what we want to think and believe. Freedom of speech, which is our ability to say what we think and believe, and to take part in discussions and debates and arguments. And freedom of protest, which is not about speaking at all, it's about acting. And freedom of speech only makes sense if you distinguish speech from action. And a lot of the examples that we've been talking about in this part of the conversation, Chris, haven't been about freedom of speech. They've been about action, disruptive action. And our ability to act, our ability to behave is, I think, legitimately more curtailed than our ability to speak, which is, I think, legitimately more curtailed than our ability to think. So what we're able to think is more expansive than what we're able to say, which is more expansive than what we're able to do. And if we remember that distinction, I think we might also begin to try and put some of this into some sense of perspective. But the takeaway point from this too long intervention is, let's just think about proportionality, not just the proportionality of what the state does to curtail our rights, but also the proportionality of what we do to each other to disrupt the enjoyment of rights. And if we thought about it in those senses, I think that some of those who are at the moment stumbling to say that the disruption of that film in Edinburgh was wrong would find it less difficult to say that it was wrong, because it was wrong. It shouldn't have happened.
I'd just like to bring Ian back in, because we haven't heard from for a while. Ian, what's your reflection on what you've heard so far? I also wonder whether the change in the nature of leadership we're seeing at the top of politics at the moment, after a decade of pretty horrible conflict, not just in Britain, but in Europe, across the West, in America, etc., whether you think that we might be moving towards an era where, the leaders are a bit more conciliatory. We might be able to approach things in a slightly different manner than maybe we have been through referendums and protests and the rest. But whatever you'd like to comment on is...
Well, that's optimistic. I hope so. Look, I think I'm taken by Adam's point, which is the answer to speech that you disagree with is more speech, right? And it's an insistence on equal speech. If you think that people haven't been heard, they should be heard. The answer is almost never, I would say never, stopping speech, and I think, all freedoms can be abused, right? That's one of the principles of a free society. We give you freedoms, and if you abuse them, that's that's the kind of, acting against the interests of a free society. And I think trying to shut down somebody's speech with your speech is an abuse of your freedom of speech, right? And your freedom of action, right? So you're free to kind of stop a film from being shown, but I would say that's an abuse of your freedom of assembly, your freedom of action, whatever you want to call it. And I think just more generally, the no debate principle has been disastrous for the discourse on this issue. And it's meant that the kind of trans activist side has not developed powerful enough arguments to persuade people who aren't already engaged in this debate, because they haven't had the practice of honing and refining and sharpening their thoughts, which is what debate does, right? And when you shut down debate, the disagreement does not go away. It just sort of becomes toxic, and it actually it polarizes the debate. It polarizes the feelings that people have about the debate. So I think it is opening up now. I mean, my sense of the whole issue is we've got over the worst of it. People are starting to have a more sensible conversation about it. But I think it's taken longer than it should have done because of this no debate principle, which I think was just a really disastrous for the whole discourse around what are incredibly important issues for the trans community and for women.
All right, thanks, Ian. We'll take one more question and then I'll let Joanna finish because she's got a hand up. Kate Harris, you've put your hand up for a while.
Yeah, thank you very much. And Ian, I agree with most of what you just said. Just very briefly, for anyone who doesn't know, the LGB Alliance, I'm one of the 2 lesbian founders of LGB Alliance. I spent nearly 3 years writing to the chair of trustees of Stonewall before we founded LGB Alliance. I just want everybody to be very clear that we founded LGB Alliance on the basis that we were not allowed to speak. And I personally wrote all those letters between me and Jan Gooding. With other trustees, we proposed a moderated session to really get to the bottom of these matters early on. And it was no debate that meant that we had to go ahead and form a separate group. My big gap that we're missing today that I just want to mention is that the problem with what's going on, the result of no debate, is now what's the growing medical scandal of children and young people who would normally have grown up to be perfectly healthy human beings, the vast majority of them to be lesbian, gay, are now believing that they must change their bodies to fit the zeitgeist or zeitgeist rather than the world must change to allow gender non-conforming people like me, like Joanna, like lots of other people on this call. We were allowed to grow up to be whatever we wanted to be, thank God. So that I think just let's not forget the violence that's being inflicted on children and supported in Scotland and Wales and England through the school system and through university to tell anyone who's a lesbian that she's a misfit, anyone who's a girly boy, he's a misfit. That is the homophobia that's running riot through the whole of this. But this isn't just, if you like, an issue for lesbians, gays, bisexuals. This is an issue for anyone who supports liberal democracy. Scotland is the home of the Enlightenment. Reason and science and informed discussion is being obliterated. So to me, people say, well, why do you go on about this? It's just a minority issue. I believe in liberal democracy. And when I see what's going on in Scotland, it chills me to the bone. Katie says what I'm saying is not factual. I'm not sure which bit is factual, but I just wanted to end on, for me, the next step is a public inquiry. Unelected groups like Stonewall, and I'm part of that problem because I helped make Stonewall the reliable voice of gay, lesbians and bisexuals for years. And I was so proud of that because we were fact-based, we were evidence-based, and we were all about building bridges. And now we can't build bridges because we're not allowed to talk. So Stonewall, I think we need a public inquiry. How did we get here? How is it that we're teaching children lies from the age of 5? You have a gender identity that may differ from the sex you were assigned at birth. That is a lie. That is destroying lives. So once our verdict comes out on our court case, because many TQ plus charities have joined together, led by Jolyon Morm, to have LGBT Alliance struck from the charitable register, to be silenced, to be put out of business. Lesbians and gays do not deserve a voice in 2023. So when our verdict comes out, whichever way it goes, whether we're found guilty of wrongthink or whether we're allowed to continue, we will be calling for a public inquiry into how on earth this is the state of affairs in public discourse in 2023.
Thanks, Kate. Now we're already past our time, but I want to let Joanna speak and then just end up with Jenny, which is where we started. So it seems a reasonably circular way of doing things. Joanna.
Well, I wanted to thanks, Chris. I wanted to come back to something that Adam said, but just in what Kate Harris has said there, I really don't disagree with any of it. And I think Katie, who spoke earlier, said that it wasn't factual. Can I suggest to her that she might want to read the interim report of Hilary Cass's review, and also might want to consider that in Australia, I think in the last 24 hours, medical insurers have said that they're going to up their premiums for doctors operating on adolescent children who are gender confused without proper psychotherapy in advance. But just to get back to Adam's point, Adam, I'm going to disagree with you a bit on what you said or what you started to say about the Republican protest at the weekend. I've got an urgent question about the policing of the Republican protests in the House of Commons this afternoon. I'm trying to get the government to make a statement about it, because in my work as chair of the Joint Committee on Human Rights at Westminster over the last year, we've done a lot of work on the right to protest, scrutinising the police sentencing and courts bill and also the public order bill. And after taking evidence, oral evidence, and listening to lots of written submissions and taking legal advice, we emphasised in our reports that peaceful protests should not be restricted and should be facilitated so far as possible. And Adam, I do think when, where, and how you choose to express your views matters. I think Republic should have been allowed to express their views at Trafalgar Square on Saturday, particularly as they've been in dialogue, I believe, for weeks with the police about how to do that peacefully. And I think their right to protest against the monarchy and to be seen and heard to do so was particularly important on the day of the coronation, provided they did so peacefully. And one of the things that we concluded in our report on the right to protest was that public authorities, including the police, are under a negative obligation not to interfere with the right to protest unlawfully, and a positive obligation to facilitate peaceful protest. Now, I don't think that happened on Saturday. I don't think peaceful protest was facilitated. And I think that there's something very wrong about that. Where that differs from what happened at Edinburgh University is the protesters, not all of whom were peaceful, actually prevented the people who wanted to see the film from seeing the film. Of course, protesters shouldn't have been allowed to stop the coronation or indeed to interfere disproportionately with the enjoyment of those watching it. But I think we're in danger of losing sight in relation to what happened on Saturday about the positive obligation of the state to facilitate the right to protest. And forgive me, Adam, if I'm maybe taking that further than you meant it to be, but I do think the point I want to make is where, when, and how we choose to express our views does matter. And for a protest to be effective, it maybe needs to take place at the time that it's of the event that it's protesting against, provided it doesn't end up exercising what Jenny reminded us earlier in the chat is called the heckler's veto. And that's what happens a lot to women like myself and Jenny and a lot of the other women who are listening in on this call, that no debate protesters prevent us from meeting and prevent us from discussing our concerns at all. That's the big difference.
Okay, Jenny, last comment from you.
All right, listen, I really wanted to very briefly just say something about how we're going to be able to get through the sex and gender and feminist wars. And I don't know if this will work, okay? But I started by outlining the 3 views that gender critical feminists have. The first, that women are materially definable. The second, that women are legislatively important on that basis in life and in law. And third, that we must be allowed to have freedom of assembly to meet and discuss issues that pertain to our lives. Now, I am unable to agree that sex is irrelevant, and people are asking me to. They're asking me to say things that I simply cannot say. I cannot say I think some men can give birth and some lesbians have penises. I cannot say that. I simply do not believe it. So the thing that and I totally accept that to some who have different beliefs, me saying to them, look, sex is irrelevant and it's important in life and law, feels to them like I'm saying something bad. And they say, no, gender identity is the most important thing, and that must be our first port of call. I know they're not going to be convinced by my argument, but we could come together on this activism, and we could come together on mutually respecting our right to express these beliefs however we want, and to have freedom of assembly to discuss these things with people who either agree with us or don't. And I fully support the rights of gender identity activists to do that, which is why the likes of Katie Montgomery or Grace Lavery were not protested by feminists.
Okay,
that's the way forward.
Thank you for that, Jenny. And it's such a big topic. It's philosophical, it's practical, it's legal, and obviously we haven't been able to touch on all of it to the extent we'd probably like today, even though we've given it a good bash. But it does seem clear to me that we can't get anywhere without leadership from higher up, and probably a different form of leadership that does try to bring people together, and that in the end makes decisions that reaches some kind of compromise that everyone can live with, and that is not a final destination, but is perhaps part of a journey that we'll be on as a society. I don't think we've had that political leadership so far. But I'd really like to thank all of our guests today. Kate had to go because she had a group meeting of the SNP. So I'd like to thank Kate, I'd like to thank Ian, I'd like to thank Jenny, Adam and Joanna, and thank you very much to you all for coming along. I hope it shed some light and not just heat today. That's our aim as Reform Scotland, and yeah, hopefully we can take something away from that and feel better informed as a result. So thank you very much for everyone for coming.